What happens when a Hollywood legend's patience runs out on live television and everything explodes in the most unexpected way? It only took 35 seconds for a pleasant conversation to transform into the most shocking confrontation Tamron Hall's show has ever witnessed. Subscribe now for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals. Last night on the Tamron Hall show, Sylvester Stallone appeared for what was meant to be a celebration of his incredible 5-decade career in Hollywood. Sylvester walked onto the set looking energetic and ready, dressed in dark clothing that matched his tough guy persona. The audience erupted in applause as he made his way to the couch, pumping his fist in that signature Rocky gesture that's become iconic. Tamron greeted him with obvious enthusiasm, clearly excited to have such a legendary figure on her show. They hugged warmly, and everything seemed perfect as they sat down together. The interview started exactly as expected. Tamron asked about his latest projects, his thoughts on the legacy of Rocky and Rambo, and what it feels like to still be working at his age in an industry that often pushes older actors aside. Sylvester answered with his characteristic charm and humor, telling stories that had the audience laughing and applauding. He talked about his early struggles in Hollywood, about writing the Rocky script when he was broke and unknown, about refusing to sell the script unless he could star in it. These were stories everyone had heard before, but coming from him, they never got old. Tamron then shifted to talk about Sylvester's personal life, specifically his family and his role as a father to his daughters. She asked about his experience raising girls in Hollywood, about protecting them from the industry's darker sides. Sylvester spoke warmly about his daughters, clearly proud of them and protective. He mentioned how he tries to guide them while also letting them make their own choices. The conversation was sweet and genuine, showing a softer side of the action star that audiences don't always get to see. But then, Tamron brought up something that immediately changed the atmosphere in the studio. She mentioned a recent interview where Sylvester had made comments about masculinity and what it means to be a man in today's world. She prefaced it carefully, choosing her words with obvious deliberation, but you could tell she was about to go somewhere potentially controversial. The shift in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. "Sly, you've talked a lot over the years about masculinity, about being tough, about fighting through adversity, about never giving up no matter what life throws at you. But some people have criticized those views as outdated or even harmful in modern society. How do you respond to people who say that your brand of masculinity is part of the problem in today's society? That it contributes to men not seeking help when they need it?" Sylvester's expression changed immediately. His smile faded, replaced by something harder, more guarded. His whole body language shifted, becoming more defensive. "Problem? What problem are we talking about exactly? Because I'm not sure I understand the question." Tamron leaned forward, her journalist instincts clearly engaged, her pen tapping against her notepad. "The idea that men need to be tough all the time, that showing emotion is weakness, that physical strength is what defines a man, that you can't cry or ask for help. Critics say that this contributes to toxic masculinity and harms men's mental health, that it leads to higher suicide rates, to men not seeking therapy, to fathers not being emotionally available to their children." There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable pause where you could feel the energy in the room shift completely. The audience members sat forward in their seats. Sylvester looked at Tamron with an intensity that was palpable, even through the screen, his famous intensity now directed at her. "Tamron, I've spent my entire career creating characters who overcome impossible odds through determination and strength. Characters who inspire people to keep going when everything seems hopeless. That's not toxic. That's inspirational. That's giving people hope. But isn't there a difference between fictional characters and real-life messages?" Tamron pressed, clearly not backing down, her voice taking on more urgency. "When young men idolize Rocky or Rambo, when they watch these films over and over, aren't they also absorbing messages about how men should behave? Messages that might not be healthy in real life. Messages that tell them to bottle up their emotions and just push through pain? Sylvester's jaw tightened visibly. His body language became more defensive, arms crossing over his chest, his shoulders tensing. My characters inspire people to never give up, to fight for what they believe in, to stand up when life knocks them down, to believe in themselves when nobody else does. If that's toxic, if that's harmful, then I don't know what world we're living in anymore. The audience was quiet now, sensing the conversation taking a turn. Tamron maintained her professional composure, but you could see she was preparing to push harder. I understand that perspective, but what about the emotional side? Rocky doesn't really talk about his feelings. Rambo solves problems with violence. Don't you think we need to show men that it's okay to be vulnerable? That it's okay to ask for help? My characters do show vulnerability, Sylvester said, his voice getting slightly louder. Rocky cries. He struggles. He doubts himself. But he also gets back up and fights. That's the balance. That's the message. You can feel things, but you also need to be strong enough to push through them. Tamron nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with that answer. But the emphasis is always on the fighting through, on the toughness. And I think what some people are saying is that we need to put more emphasis on the feeling itself, on the processing of emotions, on seeking help when you need it. So, what are you saying? Sylvester's voice had an edge now. That my movies have hurt people? That I've done something wrong by creating characters that inspire strength? I'm not saying you've done anything wrong, Tamron said carefully. I'm asking if you think there's room to evolve the conversation around masculinity, to maybe add new dimensions to what it means to be a strong man. Sylvester sat forward, his famous intensity fully engaged now, his eyes blazing. Tamron, do you know how many letters I've gotten over the years from people telling me that Rocky saved their lives? That watching Rocky gave them the courage to keep going when they wanted to give up? That seeing a character who gets knocked down but gets back up inspired them to do the same in their own lives? Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Letters from soldiers, from cancer survivors, from people who lost everything and had to rebuild. So excuse me if I don't think I need to apologize for the messages in my films. Nobody's asking you to apologize, Tamron said, though her tone suggested she was getting frustrated, her voice rising slightly. We're having a conversation about how cultural messages around masculinity might need to evolve with the times. About how what worked in 1976 might not be what we need in today's world. That's all I'm trying to discuss here. Evolve, Sylvester repeated, and there was something bitter in his voice, something that suggested deep offense. That's just another word for saying the old way was wrong. That what I've done for 50 years is somehow problematic now, because society has decided that strength is bad, and vulnerability is the only thing that matters. That everything that came before needs to be thrown away or apologized for. The temperature in the studio was rising fast. Several audience members were fanning themselves, though whether from the actual heat or the tension was unclear. Tamron's professional mask was starting to crack, her own frustration showing through in the tightness of her jaw and the flash in her eyes. That's not what anyone is saying. Nobody's saying strength is bad. But there are different kinds of strength. Emotional strength, mental strength, the strength to admit when you're struggling, the strength to reach out for help, the strength to be vulnerable with the people you love. That's just as important as physical toughness, maybe even more important in some ways. I never said it wasn't, Sylvester fired back, his voice rising with passion. But why does acknowledging one kind of strength mean diminishing another? Why can't both exist in the same space? Why do we have to tear down physical toughness and determination just to make room for emotional openness? Why does it have to be an either-or situation? Rocky shows both kinds of strength. He's tough in the ring, but he's gentle with Adrian. He fights like a warrior, but he cries when he's alone. That's the balance I've always tried to show. Tamron's eyes flashed with something sharp, something that suggested she was about to make a point she'd been holding back. Because for decades, maybe centuries. We've only celebrated one kind. We've only shown men the tough side, the fighting side, the never give up side. And it's left a lot of men struggling in silence because they've been taught that talking about their problems makes them weak, that asking for help is the same as giving up. Your movies, whether you intended it or not, are part of that cultural messaging. They're part of the reason why men suffer in silence. Sylvester stood up suddenly, the movement so abrupt that Tamron flinched slightly, her hand coming up instinctively. The audience gasped collectively, the sound echoing through the studio. This was not going according to plan. Nobody had expected this level of conflict. Are you seriously blaming me for men's mental health problems? Are you seriously sitting here suggesting that Rocky Balboa is the reason men don't go to therapy? That I'm responsible for male suicide rates? Is that really what you're saying to me right now? Tamron stood up too, refusing to be intimidated, drawing herself up to her full height. I'm not blaming you for anything. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm asking you to acknowledge that media influences culture, that the stories we tell shape how people think and behave, and that maybe, just maybe, we could all do better at showing men that they don't have to tough everything out alone, that it's okay to be human, that it's okay to struggle. My characters don't tough everything out alone, Sylvester said, his voice still raised, his hands gesturing emphatically. Rocky has Adrian. He has Paulie. He has Mickey. Rambo has Colonel Troutman. They have people they trust. They have connections. They have relationships that matter to them. But at the end of the day, when the fight comes, when the moment of truth arrives, they have to be strong enough to face it. That's not toxic. That's reality. That's how life works. Nobody can fight your battles for you. But that's exactly the problem, Tamron said, her voice rising to match his intensity, her whole body leaning forward. This idea that at the end of the day, you're alone in your fight, that when it really matters, you can only rely on yourself. That's the mentality that prevents men from building real support systems, that keeps them isolated and struggling, that makes them think they have to handle everything on their own, or they're not real men. Sylvester laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was harsh and angry, the laugh of someone who's been pushed too far. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're taking 50 years of my work, 50 years of blood, sweat, and tears, and reducing it to some cultural studies thesis about toxic masculinity. You're taking characters that have inspired millions and turning them into villains. It's insulting, it's reductive, and it's wrong. I'm not trying to insult you, Tamron insisted, but her voice was shaking slightly with emotion, her eyes bright. I genuinely respect your work. I respect what you've accomplished. But I'm trying to have an important conversation about how we portray masculinity in media and what impact that has on real men's lives, on the men who are struggling right now, on the fathers who don't know how to talk to their sons, on the young men who think they have to be tough all the time, or they're failures. Then have that conversation with someone else, Sylvester said coldly. Because I didn't come here to be lectured about how my life's work is harmful. I came here to talk about my career, my accomplishments, my legacy, not to be put on trial for making movies that inspire people. The production crew was frozen, cameras still rolling, but everyone looking uncertain about what to do. This was spiraling out of control fast, and nobody seemed to know how to stop it. You're not on trial, Tamron said. But there was frustration in every word. But you are a public figure who has shaped how millions of people think about manhood. And with that comes responsibility to think critically about the messages you're sending. Responsibility? Sylvester's voice was getting louder with each exchange. Don't talk to me about responsibility. I've been responsible my entire career. I've created characters that teach people to never give up, to believe in themselves, to fight for their dreams. That's my responsibility, and I've fulfilled it. But what about the men who took those messages and internalized that they can never show weakness? Tamron challenged. What about the men who think asking for help is giving up? What about the fathers who don't know how to tell their sons it's okay to cry? Aren't they part of your legacy, too? The words hit like a punch. You could see it in Sylvester's face, the way his expression went from angry to something more complex, hurt mixed with rage. "How dare you?" he said quietly, but with such intensity that it was more powerful than shouting. "How dare you suggest that I'm responsible for fathers not connecting with their sons? You don't know anything about me or my relationship with my children. I'm not talking about you personally," Tamron said, trying to pull back slightly. "I'm talking about the cultural impact of your work." "You can't separate them," Sylvester said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "My work is personal. Every character I've played comes from something real inside me. Every story I've told is connected to my life. So when you attack my work, you are attacking me personally." Tamron's composure was cracking now. "I'm not attacking anything. I'm asking questions. Hard questions, yes, but that's my job as a journalist. To push beyond the surface and have real conversations about important issues." "Real conversations?" Sylvester looked incredulous. "This isn't a conversation. This is an ambush. You invited me here under false pretenses, and then turned it into an interrogation about toxic masculinity. That's not journalism. That's a setup." The audience was completely divided. Some people were nodding along with Sylvester, others seemed to support Tamron. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "It's not a setup," Tamron insisted, her voice breaking slightly. "I genuinely want to understand your perspective on these issues, but you're being defensive instead of engaging with the actual questions." "Of course I'm being defensive," Sylvester shouted, no longer trying to control his volume. "You're attacking everything I've built. You're suggesting that my contribution to cinema has been net negative for society. How am I supposed to respond to that?" "By acknowledging that media has power," Tamron said, almost pleading now. "By recognizing that your movies, as great as they are, might have had some unintended consequences. By showing some humility and openness to evolving perspectives." "Humility?" Sylvester's voice dripped with contempt. "You want me to be humble about inspiring millions of people? You want me to apologize for creating characters that have become cultural icons? You want me to say that Rocky Balboa was a mistake because he didn't cry enough for your taste?" "That's not what I'm asking for," Tamron said, frustration boiling over. "But your refusal to even consider that there might be valid criticisms of how masculinity is portrayed in your films says a lot. It says you're more interested in protecting your legacy than in actually helping men today." The studio went completely silent. That accusation, that Sylvester cared more about his legacy than about men's well-being, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sylvester's face went through a series of emotions: shock, hurt, and finally settling on cold fury. "You know what, Tamron? I'm done here. I'm not going to sit here and let you paint me as some villain who's hurt men instead of helped them. That's not who I am. And it's not what my work represents." He reached down and unclipped his microphone, the sound echoing through the tense silence. Tamron watched him, her own emotions clearly conflicted between standing by her questions and regretting how far things had gone. "Sly, please don't leave," Tamron said, her voice softer now. "Let's take a breath and continue this conversation with more understanding on both sides." "There's nothing to understand," Sylvester said, standing and dropping the microphone on the couch. "You've made it clear what you think of me and my work, and I've made it clear that I don't accept your characterization. There's nowhere else for this to go." "I don't think badly of you," Tamron tried to explain. "I admire your work. I just think we can have more complex conversations about it." "Complex conversations," Sylvester repeated mockingly. "Is that what this was? Because it felt more like a prosecution. You had your narrative figured out before I even walked through that door. I was just supposed to sit here and nod along while you explained how my life's work is problematic." Tamron's eyes were watering now, whether from anger or sadness or both. "That's not fair." I asked you legitimate questions about legitimate criticisms that people have raised. That's my responsibility as a host. Your responsibility is to treat your guests with respect, Sylvester said, his voice hard as steel. To have actual conversations, not to use them as props for your social commentary. You failed at that today. The other crew members were now trying to signal to Tamron, probably telling her to cut to commercial, but she seemed frozen, unable to look away from Sylvester's angry face. I'm sorry you feel that way, Tamron said quietly, but I stand by my questions. These are important issues that need to be discussed. Then discuss them with someone who signed up for that discussion, Sylvester said, walking toward the edge of the stage. I came here to talk about my career, my films, my experiences in Hollywood, not to defend myself against charges of promoting toxic masculinity. Nobody's charging you with anything, Tamron called after him, her voice desperate now. This is just a conversation about media and culture. Sylvester stopped and turned back, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. No, Tamron. A conversation requires two people listening to each other. What you did today was lecture me about how my perspective is outdated and harmful. That's not a conversation. That's a condemnation. If that's how you took it, then I apologize, Tamron said. But her voice lacked conviction. But I still think these are conversations we need to have. Have them, Sylvester said with a shrug. Have them with people who want to have them. But don't ambush guests who came here in good faith. That's not how you build trust or understanding. That's how you create division and resentment. With that, he turned and walked toward the backstage exit. His stride was purposeful, the walk of someone who had made a decision and wasn't going to look back. The camera followed him all the way to the door. Tamron stood on her stage, visibly shaken, her professional composure completely shattered. Sly, please, she called one more time, but her voice was weak, uncertain. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back one final time. The lighting caught his face in a way that highlighted the anger and hurt etched there. You wanted to talk about masculinity? About what it means to be a man? A real man knows when to walk away from a fight that's not worth having. And this fight, Tamron, is definitely not worth having. The door swung open and he disappeared through it, leaving Tamron standing alone on her stage. The heavy door closed behind him with a thud that seemed to echo through the studio. A final punctuation mark on one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. Tamron stood there for a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller somehow than she had at the start of the show. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or just sit in the uncomfortable aftermath of what they'd witnessed. Finally, Tamron turned to the camera, her eyes red but her chin raised. We need to take a break, she said, her voice barely steady. We'll be right back. But everyone watching knew there would be no coming back from this. Sylvester Stallone had just walked off the Tamron Hall show after one of the most intense arguments about masculinity, legacy, and media responsibility ever captured on live television. What started as a question about evolving perspectives on manhood had exploded into a full-scale confrontation that exposed deep divisions in how we think about strength, vulnerability, and what it means to be a role model. Sylvester felt ambushed and attacked, accused of promoting harmful ideas when he believed he had spent his career inspiring people to overcome adversity. From his perspective, Tamron had invited him under false pretenses and then used the platform to criticize his life's work under the guise of having an important conversation. Tamron felt she was doing her job as a journalist, asking difficult but necessary questions about how media shapes cultural attitudes toward masculinity. From her perspective, Sylvester's defensiveness proved he was unwilling to engage with legitimate criticisms or consider how his work might have had unintended negative consequences. The moment when Tamron suggested Sylvester cared more about protecting his legacy than helping men was the point of no return. That wasn't just a critique of his work. It was a personal attack on his character and motivations. It suggested selfishness and vanity, rather than the artistic integrity and genuine inspiration he believed his work represented. Sylvester's final words about knowing when to walk away from a fight carried weight precisely because they came from someone whose entire career has been built on characters who fight against all odds. His decision to leave wasn't weakness or running away. It was a statement that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when you feel disrespected and misrepresented. The image of that door closing behind Sylvester Stallone became an instant iconic moment in talk show history. It represented not just the end of an interview, but a collision between generational perspectives on masculinity, between an artist protective of his legacy and a journalist committed to critical examination, between someone who believes in the power of inspirational toughness and someone advocating for emotional vulnerability. Tamron remained on that stage alone, with her thoughts and her cameras, trying to process what had just happened. She had pushed for what she believed was an important conversation, but the cost was a confrontation that left both parties wounded and nothing resolved. Sometimes the desire to have difficult conversations crashes against the reality that not everyone wants to have them.